Good morning. Hello everyone. Thanks for joining us on this webinar, the Technica Grand National 2014 webinar. So we're going to go through some of the web performance characteristics of the Grand National, of the websites covering the Grand National in the gaming and betting industry, which I'm sure many of you, not all of you really, should be will be very familiar with. So without further ado, I'm just going to introduce who's going to be speaking today. I should probably say there is, before I get underway proper, you'll see in your control panel there the ability to ask questions. So at any point you can ask a question and we will try to get through as many as we can at the end of the webinar. So feel free to ask questions. I think there's also a function to raise your hand. So if you can hear me properly, raise your hand and we'll see how that works. Oh good, I can see some hands being raised. Maybe I should have done the other way. Anyway, if you can't hear me very well, you can always send me a chat message and I'll see if I can resolve that. Okay, so let's carry on. So panelists. My name's Alex McConnell. I'm really here just to introduce the webinar and to keep everything running smoothly. I've also got Larry Haig with me. Larry will give the bulk of the presentation. He's a senior consultant here at Technica. He has 10 years of experience in end-user monitoring, helping some big clients such as Nice Retail, ASOS, lots of blue-chip clients there. And also, he's very experienced in doing this kind of external performance monitoring for us in the past number of years. We also have James Billingham, who's a performance architect here at Technica. He has 5 years of experience at IBM as a performance architect, and then a further 3 years with OpenBet, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. So some good insights to be shared there around Grand National in particular. So I'm just going to give a quick rundown. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, obviously, but just to give you some background about who we are. So we're a performance consultancy. We're an independent from any tool or vendor. We offer performance management services and trying to enable companies to have a more strategic approach to their performance to help them, get performance best practice and have more efficient running systems, things of that nature for clients such as these. So what we're going to run through today, just some quick background on the sites were that we tested and why we did this. We're going to get straight into the summary of the key findings, straight into the meat of it today, and then we'll go through, how we come to that conclusion, all those summaries, those key findings, if you like, with some screens, and Larry's going to explain all that, and then some suggestions for what we could, what would be the best practice if we're looking to the future, to the next Grand National, even say the World Cup or something like that. And then we'll have a Q&A. And I'm sure everyone will probably be familiar with a lot of these stats, but I just thought it would be good to set the scene a little bit about and show sort of how important this is to the gaming and betting industry. Obviously for the riders and the horses as well, very important because there's £1 million in prize money. I think that's probably the biggest pot of the year for the 40 runners and riders. A TV audience worldwide of 600 million across 140 countries. In UK alone, 71,000 spectators at entry, £350 million of expected turnover this year, which is bigger than any of the year. 2/3 of the adult population likely to bet. I'm sure you've seen all this kind of thing before. I think that's interesting at the bottom though. I read William Hill a few years ago took 1,500 mobile phone bets per minute on the morning of the race. So that just, we'll talk a lot about the mobile and tablet performance as well. So just to flash the screen up quickly, just to show the spread of the sites that we were monitoring. This is chosen based on who are the major players in this space, essentially, based on market share and things like that. And I'm going to pass now to Larry. If you want.
Yeah.
Oh, you've got the match then.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Larry Haig here. I hope you can all hear me. If you can't, do raise your hands. So let's kick into the meat of this presentation. So the objectives were to get some kind of general overview of performance of the major sector sites in this across this very key event. We monitored for 2 days prior to the race day, and then the day after, from a number of perspectives. So we look, and to some extent they're mixed, so I'll tell you as we go from slide to slide exactly what we're looking at. But in essence, some of the stuff is looking at pure comparative data, which doesn't tell you anything about end-user experience directly. And then the bulk of it is end-user related in one way or the other, either from mobile devices or from PCs. So let's move rapidly on. You'll see, in terms of comparison, you'll see that we're looking at site response, transaction response, but also page response. What I've called nominal availability. It's necessary to be a bit cautious about availability stats. The whole thing with external monitoring is knowing the question you're asking and trying to take steps to clean up the data so that you can rely on the results that you get. As well as that, we've looked at a payload, so what is actually being delivered, and we also, along the way, just mention the performance potential score, the in-technical performance index.
Here we are.
Okay, so let's get to some findings. Apologies for this. So it doesn't.
Oh, there we go. Just use the arrow.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. Right, I'm going to start with the end in mind, as they say. Some key findings. So the first thing is, and I should say I've done exercises very similar to this for about the last 5 years. I used to work for one of the major performance vendors before joining in Technica, and both there and here we did a number of annual studies. We looked at a Christmas one for retailers, so we looked at Grand National and a few others. But certainly as far as the vetting sites are concerned, as it says there is a trend towards increased robustness and performance. We're not in an ideal situation, as you will see, but it's a lot better than it was a few years ago, particularly bearing in mind the vast increases in traffic. And also, from a somewhat less objective but design point of view, there is much more intuitive design there. It's readily apparent how you take the shortest route to the race card and this sort of thing, and the actual numbers of clicks across the panel's sites in total has reduced and converged, in fact. So that's good news. The bad news is that there's still a range of potential, and I appreciate that to some extent to a large extent, sites have a legacy which they can only work through over time and with investment. So it's not possible to suddenly bound to instant rapid performance from one year to the next. But there are certainly some sites where providing very high performance, whilst possible, would be expensive. That is exacerbated. Any weaknesses will, of course, be exacerbated by the very challenging nature of mobile usage in particular, a combination of lower than PC system capabilities and also the connectivity bandwidth side of things, which is going to challenge anyone that wants to deliver very large sites. Now, perhaps the central theme of this is not so much response per se, but quality of service, or what I've called quality of service. Of the 12 panel participants, at least 10, i.e. 10 until I stopped looking, had evidence of poor user performance in many varied ways, and you'll see some examples. And what we're really trying to do is suggest some ways to look at these things, some of which you may have already covered, of course. but certainly missing content which has brand implications, error pages instead of landing pages, error messages, all these things have a double whammy effect. They affect your revenue directly if people abandon the site, and they have a possibly worse ongoing effect on the propensity of people to return to the site. Third-party content, there's a lot of it, not as much as in media and in retail for sure, but still fair amounts, and close attention to that is important. We saw some examples of server push technologies being introduced, and certainly good examples of good and bad implementations of those, some of which had some fairly negative effects. So we would say consider and pre-assure your performance and capacity prior to next year's event. Of the component analysis that we did within the pages, the thing that was perhaps the most often implicated was delivery of content. And certainly there are steps that you can take in order to accelerate that, and some of you do. If you do use CDNs, ADCs, etc., we would definitely recommend that you assure the quality that they are delivering to you, particularly given the cost of some of those interventions. So let's get to the results. So start with a general overview. Now this is best case ISP testing of the PC home pages, landing pages, and you can see here, that line down the bottom it doesn't look very green from here, but it's supposed to be a green line. That represents about 1.5 seconds, which is, in this sort of testing, an ideal situation to be aiming at in terms of optimizing performance. You can see that the sites are pretty much in a bunch, somewhat up to about 4 seconds. Some absolutely are less than 1.5 seconds, which is great news, and pretty consistent as well. A couple of stragglers up the top end. The one right at the top, bear in mind that what we're measuring and reporting here is not the end user perception. So it's not the browser fill time, it's the total response time of the page. So it's from the initial request until all the JavaScript handlers around the load event have fired and all the content associated with that has executed. Now, if it's below the fold, as they say, so if there's activity going on after the body of the page has been delivered, the users won't necessarily see that directly. They might see a spinning icon here and there, but the issue would be that you are increasing stress on your infrastructure and reducing its effective capacity, so that you could be looking at problems when large volumes come across. So it's worth looking at that, understanding it and managing it. The horse marks the time of the race, of course. So let's move on. Straight to the IPI. Now, you may have seen this if you've been involved with any in Technica external performance events in the past. The IPI was developed a couple of years ago. This was based on an analysis, a weighted analysis of various external metrics and correlation to performance. So in essence, we run this across a series of key metrics, and we can come up with a number which is generally between almost 0, which are the fastest sites, and 100. Those would pretty much span the 40 or so key benchmark sites in a given sector, but it's not capped. It can be beyond that. I've seen IPIs of 120, 150 sometimes. And basically what that's looking at, in essence, are the performance by design principles that are built into the site. The further to the right you are, the slower you are. That's the end user performance to high broadband end users. And the higher up the y-axis, the higher your IPI, in other words, the poorer your inherent fundamental performance by design. Now, what we see here are, we've got 3 in the star performer bracket, which is great news. There are 3 that are making a space bid up the top there, and then a whole bunch that are in the middle. In essence, the higher you are and the further to the right you are, the more expensive it is, the less economic it is to deliver consistently high performance. And, well, I'm not going to say much more about it than that, but you've got a pretty good spread there across the panel. A few very good ones, some fairly poor ones, and a lot in the middle where interventions could, in fact, be worthwhile. Let's move from best case conditions and look at some real world testing. So what are we looking for? In terms of, this is Nielsen data, this is a couple of years old, but it still holds good really. A performance to the end user of somewhere between 3 and 6 seconds will maximise the opportunity in terms of their attention span and minimise their propensity for abandonment. It isn't absolute. The slower the site, the more chance you will get that people will abandon. There are obviously a number of factors. It's not just performance. There's the functionality of the site and its design, the nature of the offer, and factors like this, but certainly performance is consistently shown to be one of the major factors. So let's have a look. What we've done, we started with a site that's got nothing to do with betting. Up the top right there, this is next.co.uk, who these days are one of the fastest UK retail e-commerce sites. Didn't used to be, but they certainly are these days, and they've made some interesting interventions to achieve that position. So here we're looking at tablet performance, the iPad 2, and we're looking across a series of progressively more challenging bandwidth targets. So arbitrarily, down the bottom, the legend, delivery of less than 10 seconds is green, 10 to 12 seconds amber, more than 12 seconds is red, and if you are taking more than 12 seconds, then expect negative revenue outcomes. So if we start feeding them in, I'm looking at 2 good sites, in inverted commas, and 2 poor sites. And after this, you might want to test your own site and see how you stack up against these. So here we see a number of perspectives from the iPad itself, so you can read across directly to Next if you wish to do so, to a smartphone device. So this is an Android, the Galaxy S4, which has still got one of the largest shares, although it's a little bit long in the tooth now, and then the PC itself. Bear in mind that with responsive design, the advent of responsive design, the actual sites that are delivered to these different devices are or should be different. They should be lighter, taking into account the more limiting capabilities of some devices. So here we see it fall away right from the off, 1 megabit per second and above, somewhat slower than Next. Why should you care about that? Only really because the big retailers, along with social media and people like this, are very much condition the expectation in use of users as to how fast a site should deliver. And any site, if you keep racking down the bandwidth, eventually will reach a threshold point, and as you can see here, that kicked in on this site around about the 150 kilobits per second. Next held up reasonably well down to that, but if we'd kept going, then they would have struggled. Every site will, of course. So that's one of the good sites in the panel. If we now look at another, again, a lot of green there, so that's all good news. A similar pattern. Interestingly, the PC was performing rather less well than the mobile devices. That's probably just because they've got a better implemented redirect or responsive design approach. I haven't quoted the page weights here, but we get to some of those later. So that's goodness. How well do they stack up if they're less good? So these were a couple of poor ones, and we can see here essentially a sea of red is creeping up. The acceptability really was only in optimized conditions of 1 megabit per second or above, and clearly if you've got armies of people seeking to communicate through a very limited number of masts, then you're going to get limitations in available bandwidth. If we go to another final one, and that's even redder. And certainly if you do that testing as an ops team and you find that sort of those sort of patterns, well worth getting onto that before next year, of course, because that will repay you in terms of revenues. So let's keep cracking on, because quite a lot to cover. So the next thing that we looked at was the effect of traffic per se. So we took two windows, one when we should realistically anticipate traffic to be low, between 1 and 4 a.m. on the 4th of April, and then one between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. on the 3rd of April, it's the previous day, but actually a busier day in terms of the days we measure. So we're looking at two things there. Response, which is the histogram down the bottom, the daytime is the olive green and the nighttime is the blue, and then the line graph is the variation, median absolute deviation, which is a robust measure of deviation, similar to standard deviation, to which it's related in some ways. And you can see that the greatest effect is that on response. Sites are much, much slower when they're under demand than they are when not. Although variability is less affected, but absolutely is affected as well, as would be expected. So again, some form of stress testing, very worthwhile, and you can see in some of these cases, I mean panel number 1, for example, vast differences there. Some others, last year we saw some sites that actually improved with demand, which probably meant they were using scalable, cloud-based solutions or something like that. But even if you are, well worth looking at the latency there, relevant to the dynamic nature of the traffic that you're seeing. So let's move on again, and let's look now, rather than looking at just home pages, look at some transactional data, and this is what I call a time to bet. So this is basically arriving at the landing page and then getting to the Grand National race card by the shortest readily apparent route. Not necessarily the shortest route, but the shortest that is apparent to a novice user of that site, which most people on Grand National Day are. So if we look at mobile devices, bear in mind that it's important to control bandwidth in terms of comparing results, and here we have relatively modest bandwidth. So half a meg to 1 megabit per second of connectivity. If we look at the Galaxy, the smartphone device on the left, then ranges between about 10 seconds and 30 seconds, so quite a big span there, all of which have got a nominal availability of 100%, but we'll come back to that in a minute because it's more apparent than real, that I'm afraid. And then on the right-hand side, some tablet device responses, and as one would anticipate, they are somewhat better, generally because you've got more system capacity there in those devices. If we look at the S4 results, and we split it out by step across the transactions, then you'll see what I've called there some alternative approaches. Well, yes, to what extent operation teams have dictated those is probably, largely they probably come from the nature of your infrastructure and architecture. So, you get, to some extent, you're stuck with it. But it is possible to shape things via prefetching and other interventions. And I just thought it was interesting here just to look at where the time went. You can see quite a range of different numbers of steps. So the fastest in this subset of the panel was 4 steps. The slowest was 6 steps. And some quite different patterns of response. Certainly this site C, although we've got some quite high percentages, that's fairly misleading really, because you just want to look at total delivery times. And as you can see here, pretty acceptable. That's a very fast site, and some evidence of caching and prefetching and so on, that kind of interventions, because some of these are very short times, of course. And some steps don't involve full page loads, I would say, as well. Contrast that with some of the other sites where you're taking, on this one, you're taking a huge hit up front, after which it's pretty quick. and this one modest but reasonably quick to landing page, and then some fairly clunky steps thereafter. Now, I think we would say it's important to understand the dynamics of performance, load time versus revenue, conversion, abandonment for your site, because that will be a unique variable, but understanding it across some key journeys is an important thing. So let's move rapidly on. Okay, so some patterns of performance. I'm conscious of time here. As I've said there in the header, there's one to avoid. So this is, I've sought to screen, we did anonymise this. A bit difficult to do when we get to the visual stuff, but I've done my best. I've screened out the names and the logos and that sort of thing, although it won't be a secret when we're looking at a couple of examples. But again, I would say, if you feel your site is perfect, then you're in a good position to feel happy about some of the examples we show. Almost no one achieves perfection. Not that it is necessarily achievable, but anyway. So here's a particular site. You're looking at ISP based, so clean room testing here, and you can see that there were some spikes to the left which aren't captured here, but during race day progressively struggling there, and they didn't, but typically you can find that sites will fall over altogether if they're in that sort of stress situation. If we move to the end user perspective, this is the same site, and now we're looking at connectivity of 1 megabit per second or above, PC end users, tertiary ISP connections. And what I've done, you can see this sort of letterbox approach. So I've screened off what could be regarded as unacceptable or deleterious performance in the top. The bottom is not that at all. It's sites that have delivered too quickly, and we'll get to why that might be, but in essence it's usually because the whole site isn't being delivered. So there's either holes in it, or it's an error page or something of that nature. So you can see when you look at that site, not only is the general trend towards slowness, but the limit of acceptability is very small as well. So they will not have, this particular company will not have maximised their opportunity on the day at all. If we look at another example here, again using the same sort of letterbox approach. So here, bear in mind the scales differ depending on the range of results, but this is, there's more in the sweet spot there. So still quite a lot of variability, still some dodgy error-related pages down the bottom, but there's more meat in there for revenue purposes. This sort of thing, these sort of scattergram approaches are much more revealing than looking at average traces. Averages can really cover up a multitude of sins. This is a different pattern. This is, again, PC end users, same sort of connection. And you can see it's more episodic there. So where the previous high variability was perhaps more systemic, there's some threshold limits there. Here it's just operating close to capacity, and it keeps tipping over the edge when you get peaks of demand. Worth drilling into that when you do your pre-testing, your performance load testing. So moving on again, that's another one, more variability, it's the Android there. So really to say, it's certainly, and you wouldn't expect it to be unique to a particular channel within your digital offer, and it isn't, but it's worth looking right across it to understand the different characteristics in different situations. Here's an iPad tablet, and I've just highlighted in red to the left there the range, very high range there, between 6 and 12 seconds total load time, allied to a lot of variability. Well worth taking that out of the equation if that site was yours. Time to bet, this is transactional stuff, and if you just look at the averages, interesting there, you can see them stepping down very nicely. The grey bar is time of race, approximately, and immediately thereafter. You can see after that, then there's no stress on the Grand National race card anyway, although there's clearly traffic to the site anyway, or for other races. So that's an optimized position, but you can quite clearly see that as traffic decreases, performance increases, and it's worth taking that out. The other aspect of this particular site was quite interesting to me, but then I'm a bit sad. So I've put a black ring around that. You can see that there's some dodgy performance going on there, and what that is delivery of the PC site to this iPad device. So, rather S4, sorry, this is the smartphone, but for some reason, some error of redirection or whatever it is going on there, and you can see that that has a direct and immediate impact. So moving on again, what I've called consistency. Let's flick through this reasonably quickly. I think you're getting the idea. This is testing from clean room conditions, from end user conditions, not end user, sorry, from best case ISP test conditions, and I've looked at a scattergram, which, as I said, is a good way of getting a general sense of things, and split it out this time by the two different ISP nodes that I was testing from Verizon and from BT. Now you should get equivalent results. They're all industrial strength nodes, they all should have unlimited bandwidth, they're all very close to the central ramps of the internet in the UK. However, you see that there are the yellow line, which is BT, very consistent results there, and there is a subset of the Verizon results which also fall along that line. However, there's also evidence of some issues there. There could be a lot of things, but it could be load balancing, could be various things. But if you're finding that, and bearing in mind that any slowdown from ISP testing here from roughly 2 seconds to something like 5 seconds can be multiplied several fold by the time you get down to your end users. So key thing is, if you don't look for this, it's silent, clearly, because you're still getting responsive, still getting site responses, and it's kind of blended out in the average results if you're not careful. And the second thing is, not only is it silent, but it has a huge multiplier effect, because everybody who, in this case, that happens to be one of the unlucky Verizon users as opposed to the lucky ones, is getting a huge hit. So they may well be abandoning. You could be walking away from hundreds of thousands of page views of traffic, who knows. But either way, big effects, big revenue effects, worth ticking that off and being aware of it. So if we step back into end users now, and I'll just click through these pretty quickly. The one on the top left and the one on the bottom right are in fact the same site but different perspectives. One's a PC site and the other is iPad. So I'll just step them out and we can walk through them. So the first one is from the top right here, and you can see what this is looking at is the payload of the site, the total number of bytes downloaded. And you can see here that you've got that classic pattern. So you've got two distinct bands there, and then you've also got sites which are clearly not delivered because they're right down there, sub, sort of 100 kilobytes in size. What this was, when we did the analysis, is multimedia. The multimedia content was missing, so that accounted for the difference there. And if you see, and again I apologise for this, but because I suppose it's apparent who this is, but you can see the difference that makes. Now I made that the captures after the event. These weren't on Grand National Day, but it's the same content. So you can see bottom right, if you don't have the lower line was delivering that user experience, the upper line was delivering what was intended by the company concerned, and quite a dramatic effect. Sometimes these things have a direct effect, they affect menus and so on. That isn't the case here, but it certainly has an effect on user perception, I would suggest. So moving on, next up, we're looking at another site, and here you can see some degradation in performance. There's some variability beforehand, but certainly on race day there, you can see sometimes, of course, they make decisions to have to deliver lighter sites on race day. That isn't the case here, partly because of the timing and partly because of the shape of it. You can see that it's gradually deteriorating. It would be a hard chop between the two if it was a men thing. But and of course, with all of this, it's to some extent inferential. I did look at the analysis of the sites, but I can't absolutely know what people in operations teams are wishing for their site, but often it's clear they aren't looking for some of the results that we find. I looked at that site again yesterday, in fact, just to see what I could see, and in fact it was even more interesting, if anything. You can see that the effect is exacerbated. Instead of having a very small effect on delivery of 30 or 40 kb, you've clearly got two distinct things going on here, and I've superimposed the object level waterfall data here. Quite interesting that both have got that long yellow line at the top, so it's long DNS times going on there, but be that as it may, the one at the top, which relates to the top line, is the full site. There's some 11 objects. The one at the bottom has a single object. That says it all in terms of the sort of experience that people will get from that situation. So sometimes it's actually being tracked and delivered as an error page, and sometimes it's just being delivered as a big blank screen. Finally, as I said, this is the one that's the same site. So we've got two things here. Here we've got, this is a mobile device, and my first thought here was, here we have a site which is having the PC site delivered to it as the top line, and the iPad rather, delivered at the bottom line, which is not uncommon. However, there's more to it than that. As we see, when we look at the PC site itself, and it's, oh my God, really, there's all sorts of things going on here. You've got pages of 2.5 meg being delivered, which is not going to do it any favours, all the way down to sub 300, which is, you know, error pages or whatever, but then two distinct, fairly distinct bands, one around the 1 meg and one just over 2. When we looked at that in a little bit more detail, again it got even more intriguing, and what we've done is split this out. There were 2 states to the iPad, 2 bands if you will, 2 states for the S4, and then there's the PC site which also had 2 states, but I haven't done the full analysis there. But you can see, if we total up, we look at the page weights, and we split it out and looked at text, images and JavaScript components there, you can see the number of images, which is often a proxy for the designs that are being delivered, and the low and the high iPad both have the same number of images. The low and the high S4 have the same number of images as well. But boy oh boy, the size of some of those that image content, nearly 1 megabyte in the large S4 case, and the largest single image is over 200 KB in size. Simply cannot afford to do that sort of thing with smartphones because they can't stand it. So what we're almost certainly seeing here is some failure of compression going on to subsets of the user base. So worth getting into that, quite an interesting one really, but worth getting into it and finding out. But as you see, it's certainly not something that is apparent if you just look at an average trace. Yeah. Okay, so we're working towards the end here, and I shall be passing over to my colleague James in just a moment. So, 2 short sections, PC versus mobile. Mobile, as everybody I think now knows, is huge. In some parts of the world, in India, some other developing parts of the world, there are more mobile users than PC, and generally, you can see this ComScore data, we're crossing over any time now. And by the time Grand National 2015 comes along, we're probably talking about a majority of mobile usage, not only MDOT or web app perhaps by that time, but certainly native mobile apps as well, and it's worth covering off those bases. So quickly now, let's just look at some benchmarks. I did say I wasn't going to do too much of that, but you can see a couple of things there. One's just the range of responses, S4 on the left, iPad on the right. The other is the page weights. And you can see that although there are quite a number of factors that affect performance, page weight is one of the major ones. And you can quite clearly see, it's not absolute, but there's a definite correlation between page weight and performance. Worth bearing that in mind when, as an ops team, you're doing battle with marketing to slim down the site and taking steps to manage the image types you're using and so on should repay itself well. So moving on, again just quickly now, these are the same sites that paired up in each case. So we've got PC versus tablet. In this case, instead of having a red band, I've got a green band of broadly acceptable performance. If you overlay that, you can see this site is doing well. This is one of the better ones from a PC perspective on the left. On the right, there's variability there with the tablet performance. So generally it's okay. It's reaching thresholds and suffering with some peaks of performance there, worth testing for that. This one, more variability on the PC site. So some of those you're going to be getting abandonment. On the right-hand side, the performance is both highly variable and slow. And you're not really within touching distance of acceptable performance there. So that company will be taking a hit on the tablet side. It's worth looking at that and covering that off. Now quality of service. That was just a grab from a timed out thing. Very quickly here, PC end users. So we see differences in the types of quality of service you can get. In this case, the Silks delivery, you can see an example of one of those images, failed between 8 p.m. on the day before the race and the race itself. Now it could be that was just switched off. It's unlikely though, but if it was, then you shouldn't be. You should take the references out, of course, so that the site isn't whirring away trying to pull stuff that isn't there. But either way, that was one thing. Here's another, some fairly nasty server 500 errors being generated in the time to bet transaction, coming across a range of connectivity, a range of different ISPs, fairly triangulated there. Now whether that represents itself as an actual 500 error page to end users or whether it's just a site that doesn't work would depend, but either way, not good news. Couple more of those, that's just quite a number, but a range of errors worth being aware of, even if some of those are content errors rather than fatal errors, but even so. This is the last one in this section. It just shows some DNS failures, only 3 occurrences, but at the time of the race, just before, 15 minutes before the kickoff. Bear in mind this is synthetic testing. You're only going to pick up DNS failures by external synthetic testing. You're not going to be able to do that using visitor monitoring, using run monitoring. So you really need to use both. And that is 3 occurrences in the number of tests that occurred in that time window, which, so in other words, it was probably all of them. So worth being aware. Okay, final section before I pass to James, component splits. So this is looking at pages and seeing where the time went. So if they were slow, it obviously went somewhere. Let's have a look. So just 4 different patterns to briefly look at. Here's one you can see quite clearly. Performance is much more acceptable in the night time than it is in the day. The colours, the oranges and yellows down the bottom are the DNS and connection times. The purple and green are the cumulative average total times. You can see that to the extent it gets slower, it's a combination of infrastructure, but the spikes are really often to do with content delivery, so worth understanding that. This one, again, without dwelling on it, you can see right up top there, content delivery, big issues with that one. If we move to the next, Okay, this one's somewhat different. There are consistently long times are the content delivery times. The spikes are associated with infrastructure deficit. Long first byte times, in other words. And what have we here? And this one is primarily the other way around. This is primarily an infrastructure issue with some spikes coming in around content. All I'd say is, I'm not going to go into these, I haven't got time to do so, but if you do this sort of analysis for yourself, you can turn up useful prompts for useful action. And there's just a content delivery for a different site, one of the panel sites on its own. You can see it is exceedingly variable, worth taking some of that variation out of the equation. So with that, thanks for your patience. I'd now like to pass to my colleague James, who will talk through some suggested tactical approaches that comes from his experience both as an architect at IBM and also more recently with OpenVet. And then I'll come back for one final slide and we'll just look at some strategic approaches. Thank you.
Right, so...
Thank you. Hello, my name is James Bingham. I'm a performance architect. So yes, as Larry said, I've worked for IBM as a performance architect for 5 years, and then more recently I've worked for OpenVet as a performance architect. So I've got direct experience of some grand national planning. Now, OpenVet are probably in the majority of the gaming sites analysed today, but certainly not all. Also, those that are in OpenVet is a critical component of the architecture, but it's by no means the whole end-to-end picture of any client at all. So this will be an overview of some general approaches and principles, not OpenVet specific, and certainly not exhaustive, just some highlights. So what I intend to go through is the importance of understanding performance, both from a business perspective and a technical perspective. So customer journey, obviously extremely important from a business perspective. What do your customers do? What business processes are executed? How is this different from a normal day with a load profile? Larry's certainly gone through a lot of detail about end users. It's very important to understand what your end users are doing from a business side. Technical perspective, so how are your applications and infrastructure hit? Grand National is a very different day to any other day in the calendar, so it's very important to understand how that load realises itself in technical stuff going on servers, certainly to make sure that you can do a good realistic performance test and actually weed out any issues before the actual day. Now, in terms of instrumentation and monitoring, end-to-end, a little bit of OpenVet specific stuff. OpenVet was part of the end-to-end picture for clients that I've worked with, and a lot of detail available in OpenVet, but only a small subset of that necessarily was real time. A lot of it was log analysis the day after or the day after that. Certainly if you want to understand what's going on your site end-to-end, then things like APM and such like are very important, probably for 2015, but Larry will talk about that later. So understanding performance from a business perspective. The customer journey, everybody comes in, they hit the home page, they go to the Grand National, and they probably go to their account pages. So very important to make sure there's a clear link on the home page. People need to come straight into the home page, which is cut down to the minimum, no push messaging on, everything coming out of CDN if at all possible, and then a straight link through to the page where they can have a look at the Grand National event page and place a bet. Also as well, customer journey, dealing with inactive accounts. I mentioned the load profile is radically different on Grand National to any other day, and understanding that this informs technical interventions. It certainly does with inactive accounts as an anecdote. Very many clients discovered that a lot of people come in and only bet on the Grand National in the year, so they come in and they go straight to their account, discover their password's wrong, they discover their credit card has expired, they discover they've got no money in the account, etc., etc. So they're hammering the account pages. And actually a very simple business process was for marketing to send out an email a week or a couple of weeks before the event and just remind people, log into your account, Grand National's coming, you might want to make sure you've got an up-to-date credit card in there. And this had a massive effect on performance, surprisingly, a rare instance where marketing actually improved the performance of a website rather than killing it. So business process, a little bit getting into strategy again a bit here, but it's very important to understand that while tactical intervention is crucial because it's an extraordinary event like no other during the whole year, it's very important year-round to understand what transactions are hit hard on the day. A lot of customers that I work with have got agile development teams, so that means weekly, bi-weekly drops into production. You may well be changing a transaction that normally on a peak Saturday hardly tickles the database, but on Grand National is one of the top 10 transactions. So if you haven't controlled the performance of that transaction year-round, when Grand National comes about, you could potentially have some serious problems, or at least some very last-minute tuning to do. Which brings me on nicely to the technical perspective. So it's very important to understand the performance of the website, and it was quite surprising to people when I joined OpenBet and pointed out that actually the front-end stuff where OpenBet is involved in the front-end is not actually hit hard at all on the Grand National. Certainly if you do your customer journey side of things right and make sure people go to the home page straight to Grand National, straight to the horse event page, everything comes out of the cache if you've configured it properly. If you protected the service and increased your cache timeouts, then more so everything comes out of the cache. So actually, usually, if things are configured properly on a Grand National, a lot of OpenBet clients will discover that in terms of CPU capacity, the front-end application actually experiences a dip in terms of the amount of CPU it uses, not an increase. So very important, because certain customers have had issues where they've over-provisioned front-end website applications, and that's caused problems with the sheer number of connections to the database, things like that. So it's very important to provision the right amount of capacity, not too much, not too little. The main challenge at Grand National is mainly around write to the database. You know, some transactions, certainly those account-based ones, you can get 20 times increase over even a peak Saturday. So, and again, sheer number of bets, Grand National, they're usually singles, they're not particularly complicated bets, but it's always the highest seen in the year. And you need to protect the service. So one of the good things about Grand National is the customers understand that it's a peak day, they understand the websites are going to be under stress. So doing things like having little friendly messages to customers saying, sorry, but your account history part of your website is disabled on this day to protect performance, that's not a problem. And also from a business side of things, ramping down the amount of trading that's going on to the database and writing stuff to the database, again, that's acceptable on the day and something you can do to protect the service. So again, back to this track key transactions and tune in preparation for Grand National. So when I was working for OpenBet, all transaction costs are tracked over the year in terms of the amount of CPU seconds, the amount of time spent, ideally the business process flow, so you're understanding what's going on with those key transactions. And considering new function introduced in the previous year again, it's quite easy for something to slip into the production system, a change to betting, a new piece of functionality that people can do that will impact on Grand National. And if your solution architects aren't considering the risk of introducing those new functions, then again you can potentially have a problem on the day. Development is agile, continuous integration, and regular drops. You really need to keep control of all of that and understand how it's going to impact on Grand National. So I'll hand back to Larry to go through some of the strategic stuff.
Right, just to wrap up then quickly, from as James has mentioned, and it certainly repays, planning ahead, so anticipate and understand traffic and behaviour. Many of you will have lots of data from previous years from your web analytics and so forth, worth digging that out and looking at trending, and also referring to trending in the usage of mobile devices, native mobile apps and so forth, because it helps to anticipate demand in that way. To the extent you haven't already, and I'm sure many of you have, detailed baselining across a range of demand is important. KPIs both in terms of external performance to end users and your infrastructure KPIs will help. And they will also enable you to get a sense of where the thresholds and the key gates are. Some of that will come out of your performance load testing. So in sum, assure your performance and quality control across quality of service, across a range of demand from all potential touch points, so all the key revenue touch points, whether they're native mobile, whether it's M.dot across a range of devices, or whether it's PCs. If you are testing from PCs, make sure you test from, you get an end user understanding, and we would suggest a combination of real user monitoring and active monitoring from the end user, as opposed to ISP based whether throttled or otherwise. Performance load testing, I'll take the opportunity of putting in a plug for my colleague in Molyneux, Head of Performance here, whose second edition of Performance Load Testing book will be coming out it's in late stages of preparation in the next 3 months. Look out for it at all good bookshops. And finally, well, good luck as you approach next year and in the interim time before we get there. If there's anything that Intechnica can help you with in the meantime, or you'd like to have general discussions, do please reach out to us.
Yeah, so we just got a quick list here of some of the, I just wanted to put this up here just to show sort of the range of kind of things that we've done. Larry just went through a lot of them. And also to mention that we do have all this data here. We did anonymize it for this presentation, but if you wanted to know more about what specifically your site looks like externally through external monitoring, we're more than happy to talk more on a one-on-one basis with you on that. Just let us know. I think we've got time for a few questions if there are any. Let me just have a look to see here. If you've got any questions, then feel free to type them in now. Otherwise, you can just email them across to me. I'm going to send an email out with the recordings for you so that you can watch it back if you need to, and also you can reply with any questions that you might have. I want to ask Larry, just to clarify, you mentioned at one point the difference between end-user monitoring and real-user monitoring. There's certain things that you can't do with one or the other. What sort of the importance, would you say, of end-user monitoring specifically, but in using both in your approach? Well,
it's a big subject, but in essence they're complementary. So these days, with the advent of broad real user monitoring availability, then the demands on active synthetic monitoring is less. So that should mean that's more economic. You can target it more carefully because you can get your core understanding from end users. But in essence, active monitoring will give you availability metrics, which are key because real user monitoring is simply visitor based, and also active monitoring will give you economically information at object level so that you can set your SLAs and monitor your individual, not only third parties, but you can certainly monitor third parties for maximum performance. So there's a lot to that, but in a nutshell, that's it.
Okay. I think I may wrap this up as we're just approaching 12 o'clock here, but as I said, any questions or anything specific to your site, do let us know. We're more than happy to address that for you. So I just wanted to thank Larry and James for coming and giving their insights here, and to everyone for attending. And that's it from us for today. Thanks very much.